Great. Welcome to the Finance Committee meeting of December 6th. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Vice McCoo. Here. Councilmember Filsath.
Here.
Councilmember Du Bois.
Here.
All present.
So we actually have a pretty big agenda today. First order is public speaking. And given the number of items, if a member of the public wants to speak generally or to any of the items, I'll go ahead and allow that now so they don't have to wait around for the whole meeting. Do we have any members of the public?
Looks like we have one hand raised.
Okay, so our first speaker is Nelson Buchanan. Nelson? Are you able to? There you go. Nelson, you were unmuted for a second, but looks like you're muted again.
Okay. Hello.
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay. Good evening. I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk, and you've got a big agenda, and I'll try to be brief. Just want you to know I read every word of the report, and but I would like to confine my remarks to the last item that's on your agenda. I'm really impressed with the overall report, and it carries you very well, I think, into 2026 with almost everything attended to that can be addressed. My comments are strictly on the long-term forecast, and one bit of wordsmithing I would like to make is that the header on page 26 says assumptions not included in the forecast. And this concept of risk is so important in the long-term forecast. I'd love to see that header rephrased as risk not included in the forecast, because staff has very carefully detailed out 21 risk or priorities for the council to consider in long-range planning. So that's the first comment I'd like to have. If you could rank order those 21 priorities, I think that would be great. And finally, please consider 3 additional risks in that same context. Very briefly, first additional thing I would add is something about sea rise specifically and the levees. The other cities, a handful of other cities I'm aware of, have actually specifically got action steps going about the levees. And it'd be nice to know where we sit in the benchmark of other towns adjacent to us, especially of what they're doing. The second additional risk I would add is the fact that work from home, well, it's going to undermine the most basic assumptions about Palo Alto, particularly office space. How are you going to address the complex changes coming from the lack of inbound commuters by car, if indeed they occur? This was something we'll all be chasing for the next 4 or 5 years. But the fact that basic dependency upon inbound commuters is a big risk. And third, that I think there's a lack of specificity about the 2 downtowns and Pacific area plans. There's so much risk just generally associated with our 2 commercial centers, downtown cores. I think that needs to be addressed, and we all know how much work Pacific area plans ought to be, but that could be addressed sometime in the near future. So thank you very much. I appreciate you considering the email that I sent.
All right, thank you, and condolences for having read all those reports. All right, so let's get started with our agenda. The first item is looking at referrals to the Finance Committee. Staff have a summary.
Sure. Ms. Paras, Assistant Director of Administrative Services, is here to go over this. And just as a beginning, this is just an information report that staff brings to the Finance Committee every December as a bit of a health check on where we're at with referrals status. And we do use this information to help us prepare for the council retreat in the coming new year. With that, Ms. Paras.
Thank you very much, Director Menose. Christine Paras, Assistant Director of Administrative Services. I'll keep the presentation on this very brief, but staff does have 4 referrals from going back to 2020 that we're reporting on. Many are in progress or pending. And quite frankly, I was going to turn it to the committee for any questions or comments on this. Or it's informational, so we don't need that. Okay, yes.
Oh, we can comment, I think. Okay, so did Councilmember Koo, Councilmember Felsa, did you have any comments on the referrals? I'm not hearing anything, so I don't know if there was no response.
Both council members have responded that they don't have questions.
Okay, I don't know if they're not using the mics, there's no sound. The only comment I had was, I think the summary of the JMZ situation it focused solely on raising prices. And I remember our discussion, there was also some discussion about, I don't know if there was no response. Oh, get a little delay there. Sorry. That it was also something about the reservation system and people making reservations and canceling. So I just thought we should make it a little bit broader than just raising prices, but also managing, I think, demand better. That was really the only note I had. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and move on to item number 2, which is pen policy and OPEB.
Yes, so we will switch out our teams here. Jessica Shumps and Paul Harper from the Office of Management and Budget will join us. And then virtually, we do have our actuary online, headed by Mary Beth Redding. And as a reminder for the council and the community, this is the city's contracted actuary. These are not our CalPERS actuaries. So they've done the specific analysis on our data, scenarios, and policies. So with that, turn it to Jessie to kick this off.
Thank you, Kylie. Next slide. We have just a brief staff presentation before we get to the actuary results. On this slide, we have the council adopted pension policy. Overall, the goal is to reach a 90% funded status by fiscal year 2036. The funding components to achieve this goal include a lower discount rate for normal cost as compared to CalPERS. Currently, the city uses a 5.8% rate as compared to CalPERS 6.8%. This rate is planned to be reduced to 5.3% beginning in fiscal year 2024. Additionally, additional contributions from excess ESR are continue to be made that are above target levels. The use of funds, such as transmission of funds from PARS CalPERS, requires city council approval. And this also includes reporting requirements. These include actuary analysis every 3 years to inform the progress of meeting goals. That is part of the review this evening. And regular status updates and annual contributions communicated in annual budget process. As part of report requirements, staff has scheduled several meetings with the Finance Committee this fiscal year. These include the review of the CalPERS actuarial analysis as of June 30th, 2021. This was brought forward in September 2022. A review of the current status of pension and OPEB trust with plan providers. This was completed with the Finance Committee in October 2022. And then this evening, which is the review of the current status of pension plans with alternative actuary assumptions and potential policy revisions for City Council consideration. Next slide. So the slide contains potential policy revisions or feedback and action. The first is to add proactive planning for other post-employment benefits and retiree health care to the policy. This is consistent with City Council direction. The adopted policy doesn't have explicit language to include proactive saving towards retiree health care. However, the City Council has directed similar actions since the adoption of the pension policy. So this recommendation would formalize those actions. Additionally, there's a recommendation to reduce the discount rate for supplemental contributions from 6.2 to 5.3% for pension and from 6.25% to 5.75% for OPEB. And similarly, this is also an action approved by the City Council. Third is to add language for investment strategy of pension and OPEB trusts, including a more conservative investment allocation once these trusts hit 75 to 80% funded or when the actuary recommends disbursements. This recommendation is consistent with recommendations discussed at the October 18th Finance Committee meeting with plan providers. And the goal of this recommendation is to preserve assets and mitigate against volatility in the market when funds are expected to be dispersed. This doesn't require budgetary action, as funding in these trusts can be shifted to other portfolios at the city's discretion. The next recommendation is to identify areas of focus for accumulated savings, such as rate stabilization and additional discretionary payments or ADPs to CalPERS. The current policy contemplates ADPs in excess of 1 year of employer contributions. This is also calculated in the actuary analysis for review this evening. However, the council may alternatively decide to accumulate savings in the pension trust with no ADPs planned to CalPERS. This option is also included in the actuary analysis for review tonight. And a third option not calculated in the actuary analysis could be to direct one or both of funding components as an ADP. So for example, the city could send excess BSR as an ADP to CalPERS to begin directly paying down the liability, while continuing to direct normal cost contributions at the lower discount rate to the pension trust for use at a later date, or vice versa. And then lastly, a recommendation to modify the actuary reporting from 3 to 4 years. And this would be to align with the CalPERS Asset Liability Management or ALM process and experience study. This would ensure that the periodic reporting aligns with significant changes identified as part of these studies completed by CalPERS. Before we turn it over to the consultants, the action this evening is to review and accept the revised actuarial pension analysis using the alternative assumptions and recommend City Council adoption of modifications to pension funding policy that's used to guide financial planning of these benefits. So with that, we'll turn it over to the actuary presentation.
Okay, thank you, Jesse.
Yep, we can hear you. And I think the clerk will start sharing the presentation. Thanks, Mary Beth.
That's it. Okay, this is a report prepared by Foster and Foster. We are the same team that you knew as Bartell Associates, but we've changed our name since the last time we talked to the committee. I am Mary Beth Redding, and I worked with Bianca Lynn on this project, who's been your consultant for CalPERS work for many years. Next page. And maybe even we can go right to the one after that. I'm going to start with just a little bit of background really quickly, just to make sure everybody's familiar with the terms we're going to be using. The first one we talk about a lot is normal cost. And when we're in the pension world, normal cost means the value of benefits that employees earn during the current year. We also talk about actuarial accrued liability. And you can think of it two ways. One is a value of all the benefits that employees have earned for a past service, or you can also think about it as the accumulation of all the normal costs that have been paid in the past. And then we'll talk a lot about the unfunded liability. And if everything had gone exactly the way actuaries expected it to, the fund set aside at CalPERS would have exactly as much money in it as the actuarial accrued liability. That, of course, is not the case at the moment. We have an unfunded liability. CalPERS calculates unfunded liability every year. And as there are differences between what is actual and what's expected, they add new layers of unfunded liability. Those are all amortized separately as part of your contribution to CalPERS. Okay, that's background. Next slide. Okay. The most significant thing that's happened in the last 2 years are CalPERS investment return. In fiscal year 21, they earned 21.3% on their funds, and in fiscal year 22, they earned minus 6.1%. Those are the announced gross returns on the fund. Between the two, it was almost expected, but the very big increase and then decrease in returns has had a huge impact on the contributions, and we'll be looking at that a little bit as we go along. The next slide, please. At the same time, we want to talk about changes made in the November 2021 board meeting. This was at the point where the good return for fiscal 21 was known. Because of that, we had the very first implementation of CalPERS's risk mitigation strategy. They lowered their discount rate down to 6.8%. But at the same time, they were doing their ALM, their asset liability modeling study, and their investment consultants told them that in order to actually hit 6.8% in the long run, they could not reduce risk from the portfolio, which had been kind of the idea all along of risk mitigation, was that when they had good years, they would drop the discount rate and pull some risk out of the fund and make it a little bit less risky. In this case, they dropped the discount rate, but they actually had to put more risk into the fund in order to hit that 6.8% target because of the lower projected earnings on assets, particularly in the short run. Okay, so that was the big change. We also had a new experience study with some new demographic assumptions about particularly retirement dates and pay increases. Okay, so that's sort of old news. That was last year. Can I have the next slide? Okay, and we'll spend a couple slides talking about really quickly what was in this year's valuation reports. This year being June 30th of 2021. They were published in August of 22. And the next slide. A little bit about demographics, since they're very important in determining the city's numbers and how they got here. What you're looking at here is a picture that goes back all the way to 1994. The red bars are the number of the city's active employees categorized as miscellaneous. So that's everybody except sworn safety. And if you look at the head counts, they're more or less level over time, although you'll see a big dip in 2021. Not surprising because of the pandemic. The blue bars are the number of retirees, miscellaneous retirees every year. And that is a number that's constantly growing. It's not done growing yet. And so what this means is you have a lot more retirees than active employees. And Palo Alto, we categorize as a mature city. It has, if you look at all the other public agency plans, you have many more retirees relative to active employees than do other public agencies in the state. That's not a bad thing. It just happens when you've been around for a while and have a lot of retirees, but it does tend to produce more volatile costs. Okay, the next slide, please. This is the same for safety, although you'll notice it looks quite different from miscellaneous. We have, even going back to 1994, at that point, there were more retirees than active employees in the safety group, and that trend again has continued and is much more pronounced at Palo Alto than your average safety plans of public agencies in California. Okay, next slide, please. This is a bunch of numbers. I know it's kind of hard to read at a glance, but what we're trying to sort of monitor is the extent to which PEPRA people are becoming more prevalent among the employee groups. So the top of the chart shows the number of PEPRA employees. If you do it by head count, PEPRA is about 44% of the active miscellaneous employees, but by payroll, a little bit less, 39%, which is expected because PEPRA employees are your new employees hired after 2013, and they're on average going to be lower paid just because they're new. The reason PEPRA is important is because those folks hired after 2013 are going to have lower pension benefits. Not necessarily all of their pay counts as pensionable, and they fund more of the pension costs themselves. So all in all, it's going to help the city's pension costs as Pepper people move through their lifetime. They become all of your active employees and eventually your retirees. The safety group is very different. Safety employees in general have a lot less turnover. They tend to stay in jobs longer. And you'll see that among the safety group, we only have about 35% of the employees in the Pepper tier and only 30% by pay. The positive way to look at that is there's a lot more savings ahead as the tier 1 and tier 2 people, safety people, will eventually retire and be replaced by newer employees. But that savings is still in the future. We're starting to experience a little bit of it now for miscellaneous. Okay, next slide, please. If we look at the funded status of the miscellaneous plan first, I've got 3 groups of bars. 2020 is on the left. The colored bars represent the plan's liabilities, with the dark blue being the amount for retirees. The light blue is separated people who are working elsewhere, and the purplish is active employees. So you see the plan's liabilities and next to it, the plan's assets. So in 2020, Palo Alto plan miscellaneous was 65% funded. June 30th, 21, with the great asset return, it was up to 75% funded. The unfunded liability dropped quite a bit to $236 million. But projected for 2022 with the asset losses, we expect it'll be about 68% funded, and the unfunded liability will go up to $319 million. On the bottom of the slide, I put a comparison. Average CalPERS public agency plans for miscellaneous were about 72% funded in 2020 and 84% funded in 2021. So this plan is not sort of below average in its funding level, in large part, I would expect, due to the large number of retirees you're carrying. It just, when things happen that are bad, it happens worse to plans with lots of retirees. Okay, next slide, please. This is the same information for the safety plan, so you'll see a very similar pattern. Although it's a smaller plan, the numbers are smaller. The funded status in 2020 was 60% funded. It improved to 69% in 2021. We project a reduction to 62% funded in 2022. And I should say that these are purely CalPERS numbers. They do not take into account what's been set aside in the Section 115 trust. Okay, can I have the next slide? The first thing I'm going to show you are some contribution projections really quickly, just based on what's going on at CalPERS. We've included in the projections the minus 6.1% return for June 30th of 2022. And we've also done stochastic modeling, or Monte Carlo simulation, some people call it, where we're using a randomly generated investment return every year to do these contribution projections based on the asset allocation that CalPERS has. And we're taking into account what the investment advisors have said, expecting lower returns in the first 10 years and a little bit higher returns after that. So we're picking up that pattern of expected losses in the short run, expected gains after that. Other than that, we've used all of the other assumptions that CalPERS has, including long-term inflation at 2.3% per year, which we still think is a very good long-term estimate, although short-term probably not so good. And continued operation of their risk mitigation policy. Can I have the next slide? So just a big picture look at where the miscellaneous contribution rates are. And these are rates meaning the total CalPERS contribution divided by pensionable pay. The green line is where we now project contribution rates for miscellaneous. So 41% of pay this year, 45% next year, kind of generally staying more or less level for the next years and then dropping off as the unfunded gets paid down. The blue line is there for comparison. Had CalPERS earned a positive 6.8% in 22 instead of a minus 6.1%, that's where the rates would have been. You can see they're approximately 10% of pay lower.
So Mary Beth,
yes.
So that whole green line bouncing around is mainly because of this year.
It would have looked like the blue line had it not been for this year. There would have still been wiggles in it.
What's causing those wiggles out in 2030?
Your CalPERS has your unfunded tracked as a series of layers of unfunded. Each one of those layers, plus or minus, has a different payment period and a different payment schedule. And so what happens is they all get paid off at different points in time. Combined with phasing in things and phasing out things, you never get a smooth pattern.
But we did minus 0.8% last year, but the previous year was a monster year. We did 14% or something like that. And so if we hadn't done that, then it would still look like the green line, even if we didn't have the 6.8%.
If you had gone back to, if you had said, what if both fiscal 22 and fiscal 21 were as expected, you would be very close to the green line.
Right.
It would have been nice to keep the good year without having the bad year after that.
Yeah. I'll take a few more of those, please.
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't get our choices here. Okay, can I have the next slide? This is a short-term look at just the next 10 years. The green line is the same as it was in the previous slide. It looks flatter just because of the scale of the graph. Okay, but it's the same numbers. What we've done is turned the contribution for the next 10 years just for miscellaneous into dollar amounts. So for 22, 23, about $38 million for the year, going up to 47 by 10 years out. So we do have an increase. But what I did want to show you with this is how it splits up into components. The pinkish line down around $10 million a year, increasing very slightly is the normal cost. That's the cost of benefits people are earning every year. And you can see it's fairly level. It's going to go up because pays go up, but it's pretty flat. The blue line down the bottom is actually slightly negative, and it represents the amount of extra money employees are pitching in to help the city. This has been negotiated with employees. And then the red line is the amount you're paying to pay down the unfunded liability. And you can see that's the biggest by far component of the contribution and also the most variable. It's the one you really don't have any control over.
So Mary Beth, what would be the impact if the employees stopped paying their share, the cost share?
So they're paying about $1.5 million each year, let's say. Excuse me. So the green line would pop up $1.5 million. It's not huge. It's really hard for employees to pay enough to make a big difference in that.
Okay. And what's the significance of 50th percentile?
Excuse me. When we're doing our simulations, we actually run 1,000 simulations with different investment results. The investment results are centering around CalPERS' assumed rate. But you get good years and bad years. So that's the 50th percentile of all those runs.
Got it. So, and what are you assuming for the CalPERS expected return?
Can we go back 2 slides? Okay, so for the first 10 years, our 50th percentile assumption is 6%. And after 10 years, we're assuming 7.5%. But then we also, on top of that, apply the risk mitigation assumption that says if they have a really good year, okay, so you're randomly throwing the dice about what the return's going to be. If they get a return that's more than 2% over expected for that year, they actually drop the discount rate, pull some risk out, and then the expectation goes down.
Okay.
So sorry, it's a long answer.
Are they all right? So okay. So they're modeling 6.6% for the first 10 years, 7.5% for the following 10 years, and they're not modeling their risk kicker inner.
We're modeling that.
Oh, you're modeling that. Okay.
Yeah. So it's the best we can do at modeling what their stated policies are at this point. Okay, can we go down? See, let's go 3 slides. Hopefully that will be safety. Yeah. So this is a similar slide to the one we saw before with safety, where the green line is our current expectation of where rates will be going from 67% of pay this year up to the low 80% of pay a few years out, and then similar to miscellaneous dropping out and becoming the level of just a normal cost when the unfunded liability is paid off. 83% is a lot. It's on the certainly not the highest rates we've ever seen, but it's on the high side. I mean, thinking about, you know, paying $1 of payroll and sending helpers 83 cents is just a lot of money. And it would have been really nice had we been able to have the blue rates, which are like 15% of pay lower. So it tells you what one bad year did, and also if we could get a good year and hang on to that, how much improvement we could see on the numbers.
Again, I think you said it, but just to belabor it. So if we look at public safety salary, it's really kind of 1.8 times what the city's paying, right?
Yes. Okay, next slide, please. Similar to what we saw for miscellaneous, this is breaking down the next 10 years contributions in dollars into their components. The city has also negotiated some cost sharing with the safety employees, a little bit higher level as a percent of pay. So you can see they're kicking in over $1 million a year. The peachy color line is the normal cost, the cost of benefits accruing every year, then much more stable, a smaller component of the cost. The biggest component of the cost is payments on the unfunded liability. And that's really what's driving your overall costs. Okay, next slide. This slide adds together the contribution protections for miscellaneous and safety into total for the city. This is, again, after we take into account the amounts that the employees are paying, looking at going from close to $58 million a year this year, increasing a little bit for the next couple of years. And then as we start really having to pay for the asset losses, increasing to $77 million a year in 33-34. So that's the end of the slides I have on the information in the current CalPERS report. We'll spend more time talking about the city's funding policy in the next few slides. Can I have, let's see, the next slide after that? Okay, so the next many slides are going to kind of walk you through this step by step. We started with the Section 115 trust balances that are committed to as of June 30th, 2022. There's almost $30 million set aside for miscellaneous and 13.3 for safety. These are invested in the PARS moderately conservative fund, and we've assumed that the future earnings on that fund, given that it is a pretty conservative fund, will be about 4.5% on average every year. We haven't done any stochastic simulation of that. We've just assumed 4.5%. Then we assumed that the city would make additional contributions to the Section 115 trust every year in the amount that's calculated as the difference in normal cost using a 5.3% discount rate and then CalPERS' discount rate for the year. And that's the 5.3%, I believe, was chosen to sort of reflect the fact that CalPERS likely won't earn 6.8%, likely will earn much less than that, particularly in the short term, and that means that the normal cost is actually being underpaid as calculated by CalPERS.
I think, although Director knows, can probably correct me on this, is that those numbers came out of the ALM study. Is that correct?
I believe the 5.3 was in there.
Yeah.
That's correct, yes.
Thanks.
So if 5.3 really is true for the coming years, especially in the short term, it means funding your normal cost at 5.3 is getting ahead of potential losses. The last thing we factored in the later slides on the projections are the policy that says once the balance in the Section 115 trust exceeds the required contribution for the year, any excess is transferred over to CalPERS as an ADP, an additional discretionary payment. And for calculation purposes, we treated that as an actuarial gain and we spread it over 20 years, which might not be exactly the way it works out. You could choose a different treatment every single year, but this is, I think, gives you a reasonable picture. The other thing that's a little bit different in these numbers is that if you recall way back in the first slide, I showed you the headcounts for the miscellaneous group, and we had a big drop in 2021 due to COVID. In all the slides after this, we've adjusted payroll for the miscellaneous group to use the budgeted payroll for fiscal 23-24 because we think those employees are going to come back.
So your assumption here on using the 115 trust, isn't that different than the city's current policy?
I believe that is a current policy, that it will excess over a year's contribution are passed back to CalPERS.
Okay, I wasn't sure if it was we accumulate a year's worth and then we pay that entire year's worth, or we're just paying the excess. But you might be right here. I don't know.
It's just the excess above and beyond the annual contribution.
Got it. Okay. And did you model it, directing those ADPs at maybe particularly bad, I don't know what we call them, layers or tranches?
No, we can do that. It's really time consuming. And so we did this 20-year amortization as pretty close, giving pretty close to that result, and a whole lot easier to do.
But if the city were actually to do that, would it be worthwhile?
Typically, if you're trying to save long-term interest, you're better off always addressing the AP to the longest outstanding basis, which would typically be a 20. So since CalPERS' current amortization policy is 20 years, within a couple of years, a 20-year base will be the longest you'll have.
And yes, to the chair's point, to the extent the city transfers any funds in excess of our annual required contribution to CalPERS, we would work with our actuary to determine what basis year was the most advantageous for us to pay off at that point in time.
Does it really make a difference?
Yeah. If you look at sort of the bookends, back when we used to have 30-year bases, the difference between paying off a 30-year base and some people had like 5 or 6 year bases was really large in terms of the savings. The reason is if you pay off a amortization base that only had 5 or 6 years left, it's like you're spending that contribution over 5 or 6 years. It gets spent really fast. There's like no interest advantage to it. If you pay off a long base, it's like you're spending it over 30 years and a lot of the money sits around and earns interest in the meantime. So there are a lot more savings if you pay off a longer base. Did that make sense?
I think so, but I'm still trying to sort of sort it out with my present values and future values here. So, but I think so.
Okay. I think it's not going to have a huge impact on what we're talking about. So if it's okay, we'll go ahead and we can come back and talk about it if you want to. Okay. We have one chart that just looks at, just in terms of numbers, what's the current normal cost on CalPERS basis for miscellaneous and safety. So sort of $11-12 million a year for miscellaneous, sort of 6-7-ish for safety. And then if we calculate the normal cost at the lower discount rate, we're looking at sort of $18.5 million for miscellaneous and the $9.5 million range for safety. So it is a really big difference in the normal cost. Can I have the next slide? So showed pictorially, this is the next many slides are miscellaneous only. I'll tell you when we switch to safety. So this is miscellaneous. The peachy color line is the normal cost for the miscellaneous group, similar to what we saw in the previous slides, except it is adjusted for the higher budgeted payroll. And the red line on top, the red bars on top, are the additional normal costs that you would pay by using the lower 5.3% discount rate. So you can see what the comparison is. It's a big piece of contribution. Have the next slide. If you look at the additional payment, though, not compared to just normal cost, but compared to your total CalPERS contribution, it's not quite so scary. It's still a large amount of money, but relative to the annual CalPERS payment, you can see it's not that big. It's not like you're doubling your payments. Okay, so this would be the projection of the peachy colors are just what CalPERS would ask you to pay in the future, and the red bars on the top are the additional contributions that would be made calculating normal cost at 5.3%.
And again, this is 50th percentile. So your assumption of discount rates is 6% for the first 10 years and 7.5% for the next 10 years.
Yeah, for returns, yes. Yes. Okay, next slide, please. So if you followed that, if you did just that, calculated the normal cost at the lower discount rate, took the difference and put that difference into the 115 trust, the 115 trust would grow really fast. It would look like that blue line. So I put that blue line there and compared it with the required CalPERS contributions. The same as we saw in the previous graph, but we really had to change the scale a lot to show you the trust balance. What you can see is that pretty quickly the trust balance would grow to be much larger than the CalPERS required contributions. A kind of an obvious result. So let's look at the next slide. If you stopped there, okay, just putting the additional payments into the 115 trust, letting it grow and grow and grow and grow. And then we looked at what's the funded status. First of all, in the orange line, peachy colored line, CalPERS without the 115 trust, just on its own, because CalPERS doesn't know the 115 trust exists. And then compare it to what's the funded status if we add the assets at PARS, the 115 trust assets to the CalPERS assets, where are we? And when do we hit 90%? So without the 115 trust balance, we hit 90% in 2038. It pulls back 4 years if we take into account the 115 trust.
And we would stop 100% funded, right? Like the chart that goes, what's it mean to go above?
So what happens when you get 100% funded is that you're required to keep paying normal cost. And if you have good asset return on top of paying normal cost, you get more and more funded. What you would, so sort of not really the point of tonight's discussion, but one great thing about the 115 trust is if you get in the situation where you are overfunded, rather than making those payments out of your budget, we would recommend using the 115 trust balance to pay CalPERS.
Got it. Okay.
Okay.
We've got some time before that happens, though.
Yeah, exactly. Like to
Right.
be in that situation.
Right. Okay.
Although, you know, that was the case prior to 1999 for most of
It was. It was. Let's see. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, so now we said that's what happens if you just leave the money in the 115 trust. What if we implement the funding policy and say that every time the 115 trust gets as much or more money than the required contribution for the year, we pass the excess over to CalPERS. So this chart has 3 lines. The peachy colored line is the same, so required CalPERS contribution if nothing happened, that we've been looking at before, and it's just sort of a ghost there for background. The purple line is what happens to the CalPERS contributions if we start regularly transferring money from the 115 trust as it becomes larger than the required contribution. So you can see the first few years it's the same, and then as money starts getting passed to it, the purple line is lower than the peachy colored line. The blue line tracks the balance in the trust. So when the blue line gets over the purple line money moves to CalPERS, the contribution comes down a step farther and so forth, and they kind of remain close to the same dollar amount in the future. So it is having a big impact on your CalPERS contribution, this moving of money over. But then as the CalPERS plan becomes better and better funded, we kind of end up drawing down the trust because it's not needed. Can I have the next slide? This is a closer look at just the 2 contribution numbers. The peachy colored one is the CalPERS contribution if there were no 115 trust, and the purple line is where we got to by transferring money from the 115 trust to CalPERS as the balance went over the annual contribution. So you can see it's pulling down the contribution quite a bit. And so the white area between those 2 lines is the savings you're getting from CalPERS by having this policy. Next slide. This one looks at it a little differently. It's really the same numbers. The purple bars are the annual contributions that would be required under the funding policy would be required to CalPERS. The peachy colored line is again the if nothing changes CalPERS line. Those 2 are the same for the first several years. The reddish top of the bar is the money you're putting directly into the 115 trust. Okay, so the total of the bars is the city's funding policy. It's more than is required by CalPERS in the first 10 to 15 years. And then even in total, after that drops below what CalPERS requires, what you would have paid without this policy. So the white area again is savings. And can I have the last slide, please? Okay, so this same thing we looked at before. The peachy colored line is the funded status of a trust, just looking at CalPERS. And the blue line is if we add in the balance in the 115 trust, even with this transfer to CalPERS, when the trust becomes larger than the annual contribution, when do we hit 90% funded, and the date moves back the same 4 years, just really because of rounding, because the assets at CalPERS are so big. Having the policy making ADPs did not shift the 90th percentile date more than a year. Okay, that's all the way through miscellaneous. Did that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, safety is pretty much the same. I could go through the safety slides, or we could just skip and go to the last slide and look at the savings.
Do that. Let's skip.
Let's do that. Okay, so go all the way to, I don't know, about slide 35-ish maybe. Keep going. Stop. Perfect. Okay, so we wanted to calculate the savings by the city having this policy. And to do that, first of all, we calculated the savings as 2% at the 3% per year interest rate. It's hard to know what rate to use, but we want to use a rate that represents sort of what the city could do with its money if it didn't have to give it to CalPERS. So we use 3%. We don't use a CalPERS investment rate. And the second thing we said was, well, if I'm trying to calculate the savings, I don't want to assume that the city keeps this funding policy in place forever and ever, because it wouldn't make sense to just keep funding extra forever and ever, even after you were well over 100% funded. And so what we said is, let's say the city stops this policy when you're 90% funded, because that's kind of your goal. So we'll just look at savings through that date. And there's really two pieces of the savings. The first is the difference in the city's cash flow. So how much you would pay to CalPERS if you didn't have this policy, the difference between that and what you would pay to the combination of CalPERS plus money in the 115 trust with the policy. And so that's what's shown on the first row. We looked at the difference in cash flow for the first 30 years. And actually, the plan becomes, on average, well enough funded that when you get towards the end of the 30 years, so cash flow is the same in either case. For the miscellaneous plan, it's a present value savings of $16 million for $7 million, total $23 million. The second thing that happens is that if you look after 30 years, even though there's no longer a difference in the model and in the cash flow, there's a lot more assets in CalPERS and in the 115 trust than if you didn't have this policy. And the present value of the difference in those assets at the end of the 30 years for miscellaneous is $34 million and $20 million. Okay. So the total savings over 30 years for the two plans is about $77.5 million. So to us, it's a pretty good savings. That is, I should say, we've already taken into account the extra funds you've paid in, and so it's a savings that's pure savings.
Well, it seems to me that in the long term, notwithstanding we're all dead in the long term, but in the long term, the objective, and whether it's to get to 90% funded or 100% funded, it's essentially to get down to the point where we're only paying the normal cost every year. Right? That is, once we've paid off the unfunded liability. So the savings is going to be, basically the integration of the unfunded liability payment from now till that time. And then, whether we get that in the first 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, it's going to be that. At least that's what it seems to me. So the savings is going to be the unfunded liability payment. Because we get a bill for two payments from CalPERS. One is the normal cost and the other is the unfunded liability payment. And so once we get through paying down the UAL, then the unfunded liability payment goes away, and that's the savings.
That's the savings in the future, but you have to consider how much you paid in advance to get that savings.
You mean in terms of if we pay it down over a longer period of time, we pay a lot more interest costs?
So I'm trying to remember the numbers, and I'll just make something up that's close. When we look at miscellaneous, can you scroll back to maybe about 10 slides till we get to miscellaneous? Let's see, go another one back. Okay. So if you look at this picture, you've paid in the first years, you've paid a lot more money than you had to CalPERS. You're paying over that orange line. And as a result, after that, in the later years, you get a savings, you get to pay less because the unfunded liability has gone away.
Oh, I see what you're saying. You're saying theoretically you could smooth that out so it was all, one linear that was lower in the in years and higher in the out years.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So when we did our savings, we did that. We took the savings, but then we subtracted out how much you paid extra in your term to get that savings.
Yeah, one thing I'm really interested in, Mary Beth, is again, the investment strategy with the 115 trust and this payment ADP strategy, basically. What have you seen other cities do that you've been working with?
There's a wide variety of things. I think most cities tend to be, there's a variety of investments. I think they tend to be a little bit conservative, perhaps not as conservative as you, because they're excited about making money. But frankly, most of the cities we work with have not come up with a policy of when they're going to use this money they're setting aside. They tend to make only ad hoc contributions as they have extra money, and very few of them are getting a substantial balance.
Does anyone have a strategy of making a payment maybe in a down year? Is there any logic to that, where you basically are investing at the bottom of the market?
We've talked with them, not so much about investment strategy, but maybe a little more of budget stabilization, of making a higher payment in the years when your contribution drops, your required contribution drops. But it's just difficult for us to see that has happened.
And again, comparing Palo Alto to other cities in California, we're not doing very well, right? Our unfunded liabilities is pretty large.
I hate to say you're not doing very well, because it implies that you've done something wrong in the past. And you haven't done anything wrong in the past except be around for a long time. You've always paid what CalPERS told you to pay. But given that, you're still much less funded than most other agencies, and your contribution rates are on the high side.
Also, in the past 2 years, there's many agencies issue pension obligation bonds that pop up their funding status.
Yeah, again, not suggesting that you should have done that, but if you look around there are some agencies that are now very well funded because they did that and chose to take on that risk.
Are those voter approved bonds to pay for pensions?
No.
What is the pension obligation bond?
It's I can't tell you. It's a bond that is issued by the city. It doesn't need voter approval, but it does need a court. There's a process where you do have to go to court and it can be challenged. But if you look particularly at 2020, you could issue these things for like 3%. And again, always taking a risk, but if you issued a bond for the amount of your unfunded liability and put the money into CalPERS, likely it was a good deal. But
And it was
take up a lot of risk.
Yeah, backed up by the assets of the city, the buildings and things.
Yeah. And what you don't see is you'll get numbers from CalPERS that show that these plans look really great. They're well funded, but you will very rarely see the debt service payments added together with the CalPERS payments.
Well, exactly. You still have to pay the debt, and the question is, have you got a financial vehicle that allows you to arbitrage between interest rates?
Right. And
Or
at 3% it was a lot easier. You're not going to get that right now.
yeah, I mean, wasn't it clear that it was worthwhile if you're paying CalPERS, you're assuming a higher rate and you got money for 3%?
There is a chance CalPERS won't earn like 3% plus of the fixed costs, but The other thing that happens is, particularly if you paid off your home funded liability, now you're overfunded, you still have to pay your normal cost. And there's pretty much a bigger risk that you're not going to see any cash flow savings.
Well, it's also a little bit, you have to make the right comparison too, because if you do the pension obligation bond, you have to serve the debt somehow, right? So that takes some money. You could make a case that you could take the same amount of money, put it in your section 115, invest it at 5% a year, and be in the same spot you are with the pension obligation bond.
Not the same, close.
Yeah, we're close.
So one of the questions tonight is also OPEB policy. Is there any presentation about OPEB or discussion from staff?
No, the OPEB side of it was to true up the actions that the council actually already took on the OPEB plan that was reviewed by this finance committee back in May. So we went through the same actuarial studies back in May and synced our OPEB proactive funding contributions with the policies of our pension proactive contributions. And so part of truing up the pension funding policies adopted by council is to incorporate both sets of policies in one document as opposed to separate.
Okay, but you're not really asking us to break any new ground here.
I'm sorry?
Not really breaking any new ground. We've already passed these things separately, so you're asking.
Correct. On the OPEB side of it, we're not necessarily breaking new ground. These are things that the council has approved already. Now what this does is memorialize it in the funding policy, and it also helps us keep our proactive funding policies together in one spot, so that it's not, you know, a council motion over here, a staff report over there, a pension policy over here, and a budget. So now what this action would do is pull in all of the direction that the Council and Finance Committee have given us over the last few years as we've adapted and morphed our activities around OPEB and pensions into one now complete policy document. And obviously, there are some assumptions in there for this committee's consideration, as Jesse outlined, associated with what are our cost assumptions for the normal cost contributions. Do we want to, or how do we want to allocate resources from our 115 at present? Current policy says, as Mary Beth modeled, that we would take, once we hit 1 year's worth of contributions, any excess would be shifted to CalPERS and the like. So I won't go through all of them, but those are the kind of policy changes or policy tenets for this committee to review on whether or not these are the right adjustments to the funding policy.
So I want to go back to what we started to talk about before, which was we had the kind of discussion about the investment strategy for the 115 trust. There was some discussion about moving maybe to more of a moderate investment from our more conservative. And I think at that time we said that when we started the 115, we started very conservatively. We thought we were going to withdraw it in 3 years. That didn't happen. And so really just wanted to talk about, well, what if we aligned the investment strategies for OPEB in the 115 to be a little more moderate? And then, you know, or I think we talked about potentially tiering it too, right? If we had a payment coming up, could we split the 115 where part of it was more short-term and conservative, but the bulk of it was a little more moderate investment?
Right. So I believe, and if we look at the staff report, the kind of policy questions are exactly as you're outlining, Chair Du Bois. If you look at the packet page 62, you can see some of those policy revisions that are recommended. And one of them, to your point, is what do we do for the investment strategy of the pension and OPEB trusts once those trusts hit once our pension and OPEB plans hit 75 or 80% funded. And so that's, to your point, when we would recommend certain levels of disbursements. And so when you hit those disbursement points, you again want to perhaps tier your investment assumptions so that you can mitigate risk when you're going to be pulling money out, but also have the more aggressive assumptions for those funds that are just going to stay in there as that,
Yeah,
support.
well, I think the difference is I am suggesting less conservative than we are now, right? For the longer term funds.
Yep. Yep. And so we could go into, as if you recall, there were, I want to say 5 to 7 investment strategies in the PERS account. We're not in the lowest, which is conservative, but we're in the moderately conservative. So we could move up a notch or two into a more aggressive portfolio
Right.
strategy.
Right. I think they talked about a balanced was where a lot of cities were going.
Yeah.
But it seems like this decision is also tied up with our ADP payment strategy. And would it make sense? So the current policy of investing the excess of 1 year's worth of payment versus would it make sense to bunch those payments up and make a larger payment, maybe in a loan frequency so that we'd have a longer investment horizon? Or does it not really make a difference?
I'd be curious, Mary Beth, your perspective on that. If it's better for the city to, as you've modeled and our current policy says one year and then sweep the excess, if it would be better for us to time it differently.
So I can't give you investment advice. But when I think back to what I know about investments, I keep hearing that dollar averaging is a proven strategy, and timing the market, unless you're lucky, almost never works. And so with that in my head, and again, this isn't advice, it would seem like this strategy, because it moves a little bit of, after you start it up, it moves a little bit of money every year, might be a little bit closer to dollar averaging kind of philosophy.
I guess I'm thinking about not like an investment strategy, but it's really this, the part that makes me think about this is it's the payment plan and having these different layers of, rates in our pension.
Let me chime in on that a little bit. I think it's really important.
Yeah.
I think it's really important that we distinguish between saving money towards our obligations and giving money to CalPERS. Those are really different things now, because our pension savings, we now have 2 accounts in our pension savings, our PARS account and our Section 115. And most of all our thinking and the thinking expressed here is really sort of has the PARS account at the center of the world. But the reality is, especially if we get a significant amount of money in our 115, we really have one pension savings trust. It's got 2 accounts in it. And so we need to distinguish between putting money into our aggregate trust versus just moving money from the Section 115 into CalPERS. Because the first of those is saving more money, but the second is just moving money we've already saved in between accounts. And so I think we got to be very careful to distinguish between those 2 things.
Yeah, I agree. And again, the time horizon is important. And, again, we kind of thought the 115 was shorter term, so it's very conservative and it hasn't had the same returns CalPERS had over that time period. But if we knew we were going to make those payments
right
less frequently, then maybe be more comfortable with like the balanced investment portfolio.
Well, I think, given the long time horizons here, I think it makes sense to be, we were right to be conservative as we sort of figured this out as we went along. But I would support your direction of being a little more aggressive in the Section 115 investment strategy. I think because we're looking at very long-term stuff.
Well, but it depends if we make those ADP payments, if those are.
Well, it doesn't it doesn't. It doesn't. The question is, what's the risk return of the overall portfolio? Okay, of the section 115 and the PARS account together. I mean, that's really what you want to look at, right? I mean, so.
And it's
And
important.
the reality is, you know, the amount of money in the section 115 is so tiny relative to the amount in the PARS account. It doesn't make any difference right now either. Now, if we ever had, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars in the section 115, then it would make a difference, right? But right now, I mean, the portfolio return is the PARS portfolio return because 4% of it is the section 115.
And so just to add on that, what I think the policy question here is, at what point do we, as an organization, want to, I think what Councilmember Du Bois was saying, transfer funds from the 115 to CalPERS? Right, we have our total pension liability, as Councilmember Phillips says, you have two bank accounts essentially at this point. And at what point do you move money from one bank account to the other? It's also a one-way transfer. It only goes, you don't go back and forth. It just goes 115 over to CalPERS. And so if, to your point, if the committee's desire is to leave the funding in our 115 and let it grow, then absolutely you would want it in a more aggressive investment portfolio. The intent is to manage that 115 trust and only have the balance of it stay at a certain level for that kind of, to your point, if we need it aspect, then you might want to go with a moderate assumption because you'll be taking money out of it on a routine basis because you're going to continue to feed money into it as we use the more conservative assumptions.
In which case, the section 115 will always be tiny relative to the PARS
That's
account,
correct.
in which case it doesn't matter.
Exactly.
Right.
That's exactly. So,
And
just a policy question.
And just to play this out, I guess the risk of keeping everything in the 115 trust is that at some point our unfunded liability generates maybe negative press for the city or impacts our ability to do financing. Is that what ultimately we'd be looking at?
Not necessarily. To your point, to the extent we leave the funds in the 115, it does not get reported financially as you would see the CalPERS numbers. So yes, it would require some explaining to the public markets. Because it wouldn't be immediately demonstrable in our ACFR or our CalPERS actuary reports since they are separate. I would argue, though that's untested, that we would obviously work with the rating agencies at that time to explain and show them and prove to them that we do have those assets. What I would also say is in terms of the 115 trust just growing is you are paying interest on your basis years, right? Mary Beth was talking about the amortization period. And when CalPERS is looking at that from a present value perspective, it's a mortgage. So just like a mortgage, you have a principal and you have interest that you're paying. And so to the extent you're not outpacing that interest you're paying on your mortgage, then you're actually losing money by not giving it to CalPERS because you're earning less in your 115. So you have to think about how CalPERS would use those funds, because when it's in that 115 trust, there are pros to that. We have full control over it. It is our funding. We can choose how it's invested. We can choose when to take money out of it. No one can touch it but us. There are cons to it in the sense that you still have a mortgage and you're paying interest on that mortgage in CalPERS. And CalPERS is calculating your annual contributions based on what's outstanding in your mortgage. And so there is no way other than to give CalPERS an ADP to materially change that mortgage. And so pros and cons, I guess.
Hey, let me ask on that. Do we have, I mean, does CalPERS give us a menu of risk versus return options for our portfolio? That is, do they say you can have a really conservative one or a really aggressive one, or is there just one thing that PARS is invested in?
I'm sorry, PARS or CalPERS?
CalPERS.
CalPERS is investments are managed by their board. So we do not have this.
So we don't get to say, okay, so my slide actually is right. Okay.
Right. And we could characterize their investments as very aggressive.
Yes.
That's my mutualization of debt argument. Okay, so
yeah.
So I wanted to ask.
Right.
to something a little bit higher level before we get into this discussion. And let me start off with, so the chart we've got before us, we've seen charts like this every year. And, if you go back and look at similar charts from a few years ago, we've got projections of, the 50th percentile looks like this, and the 75th percentile looks like that, and so forth. And, and we don't hit those. Okay. I mean, in 2015 here, pension expenses for miscellaneous as a portion of labor costs were 26%. And the 50% projection at that time was that they would peak in 2022 at 35% and then fall after that. Well, here we are at 43%, which is actually worse than the 75th percentile projection. Okay. And I think that's sort of two components to that. But I think what would be really helpful is to have a version of these charts based not on CalPERS 50 and 75th projections of expected returns, but on ours. Because if you look at the history of this, I mean, numbers like, look at the ALM. The ALM comes back and says 5.3%. CalPERS says 6.8%, maybe 6%. Right? When we started doing this, CalPERS, their version of ALM was they used outside consultants, and their consultants said 6.2%. CalPERS took that number and said, how about 7%? Right. So if 5.3% really is the number, then I suspect there are two sources of error in some of these charts. I mean, these charts reflect amortizing the UAL. And if the discount rate is 5.3%, not 6% for the first 10 years and 7% for the following 10 years, then the actual UAL, the future value of the UAL, is bigger than this, in which case, it's not going to amortize because it's amortizing to the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. The other thing that's a factor in here, I think, is this is strictly looking at the UAL itself. But if the real ROI is 5.3%, but we're paying normal costs based on 6% for the next 10 years and 7.5% afterwards, then we're not paying enough as normal costs. And that means we're going to be adding new debt to the UAL every year. And so trying to amortize that, first of all, it's not big enough, or first of all, UAL is bigger than it looks. And second, we're shooting at a moving target. So I think if we believe that 5.8 or 5.3% really is the real number, because, the ALN number goes into the CalPERS black box and comes out as something different, right? If we think 5.3% is the real number, then our policy of paying CalPERS their normal cost plus putting the difference in the section 115, that means that we're not adding new debt to the UAL every year, right? Which is one of the major sources of error. But it's still the question of what discount rate should we value the UAL at? And so I think it would be helpful to see what these charts look like with, if you used not 6.0% followed by 7.5%, but the ALM numbers that we're using for our discount for our normal costs as that too. I'd like to see what that looked like in future iterations of this, because again, our goal here is to amortize all this off. And so it may be that CalPERS amortization plan is close enough that it works, but it would be nice to see that. So even before we start talking about how much in the section 115 versus how much in the CalPERS, I'd like to see sort of a different picture or an alternate picture of what the whole UAL amortization plan looks like first. Because when we talk about, when we get to 90% funded, well, are we talking about 90% funded by CalPERS definition or by our definition? I think we got to think through that kind of stuff. Is that something that we could have in future incarnations of this?
Yes, but you're not going to like the answer.
Well,
I really
I mean,
don't like
if the answer is what the answer is, I'd rather know it than not know it.
Yeah, it can be done.
I mean, again, you know, you guys can't see this, right? I'm here looking at the 2015 projection, right? And, you know, I mean, the 50% projection looks like it's going to go down, and the actuals are still going up, right? And so I'd like to know what reality is.
Yeah, it is
We
discouraging.
can handle the truth.
But, you know, Eric, you said you want to see that first, but I think we're being asked tonight to make some policy decisions or recommendations to council, I guess. Would it be useful? I thought attachment B is like the best summary, right? You guys have that in a slide.
Actually, can I go back to the point about not liking the answer? What I really don't like is having $500 million in unfunded debt. That's what I really don't like.
Yeah.
And this is where it came from.
So, I mean, we could probably talk about this all night.
Yeah.
If we can pull up attachment B.
Yeah.
I believe, Jesse, are you working on pulling that one?
Yep, we're pulling that up. It begins on packet page 120.
Thank you.
So should we just kind of talk through this row by row and try to come to an agreement?
And at a high level, just to orient folks to what's on the screen, we have non-dated what the current policy stipulates, and then what's shaded are the opportunities for changes that staff have brought forward, either in alignment with things that council has already provided us direction on, and or further adjustments based on these conversations we've been having.
So the first one here is really the pension using the ALM. We had agreed to this kind of 2-year phase in. I guess, and are you saying did we also agree to the OPEB already?
Yep, OPEB's already done.
Okay.
That's how our 2023 budget was planned.
Right. But again, it seems like we feel pretty good about our funding for OPEB at this point.
That's correct. I think the proactive contributions that the council and this committee have made recently in alignment with OPEB is a little bit less complex than pension in the sense that there's only one bank account, our bank account. And so I think in my opinion, the committee has done a great job of setting us up to have the investments as a long-term investor in the most aggressive policy that it can, but we're funding it at a more conservative policy.
Yeah, and again, so the reason that discount rate is higher is because we have basically riskier investments.
That's correct.
But that's worked for us.
That's worked for us. Yes, we have riskier investments and we fund it at a less risky discount rate assumption. So we're making those additional payments.
Okay. And then the last one on the page here. This is the one where I'd really like maybe some help on some language, but again, I'm interested in us moving to, perhaps the balanced portfolio for long-term 115. And we need to define what long-term and short-term are, how we manage that, right? Any suggestions, Kylie?
I can. I was curious if the committee, I'm watching the committee members and I'm curious if either of them have something to contribute.
I don't see the camera in the chambers anymore.
Well, so I think that at least how I think about it, and there are many ways to think about this. sources and uses, right, from a financial perspective. So to what I think you're trying to get at, there's the investment strategy that we want our 115 investments in, and whether that's aggressive or conservative or moderate, frankly, balanced. And then there's the uses of it. And so if the intent of the uses of the trust, the 115 trust, is to grow exponentially, to say, a 9-figure balance, $100 million, $200 million, then you can put it in a risk strategy with the intent of never pulling money out. But if the intent is that we do balance our assets between the 115 trust and the CalPERS, because there are risks and rewards in each account, then I would say that setting some sort of threshold as to what is that number that we would like to have in our 115 trust is a good starting point, or at what funded status we are in CalPERS. I would almost argue the former is a more clean solution. And then beyond that, I also think that what staff would also recommend is that any recommended contributions or ADPs, at least from the 115 trust, be brought forward as part of the annual budget process in alignment with this policy. That way, if the timing's just off, there's a vehicle to have that discussion on the movement between the bank accounts.
What if we just said, our portfolio policy, I'll just pick a number out of the air. Our portfolio policy is 90% of our pension assets in CalPERS and 10% in the section 115 trust. I mean, what if we just said something like that?
Absolutely. We absolutely could do something like that.
Tom, what do you think?
That's kind of the current plan. It's capped at the annual CalPERS payment. So I guess 10% would probably be a lot higher than where we are now.
That's correct.
Yeah, we're about 4% now.
Yeah. I mean, are you literally suggesting 10%?
Not necessarily. I don't think it matters that much, right? I think the most important thing is we got to make sure that we put the true normal cost and an adequate amortization payment every year into savings. And which one it goes into, I think, is a secondary kind of thing. And it's not that it's unimportant, it's just that it's not top priority.
Yeah, so I'm looking at what's on the screen and trying to, come up with a suggestion that encapsulates this.
Sure. And I mean, and ultimately one of the decision of this committee could be, don't change the policy. Leave the goal at 1 year's worth of funding in our 115 trust. And as that trust fund accumulates more than 1 year's worth of pension contributions, transfer it to CalPERS. There's nothing that says that the original policy that we started this with is incorrect. We could easily do something like that and increase and change, I should say, the investment from moderately conservative balanced.
Well, I mean, I'm looking at the OPEB policy and saying, why can't we align them? Why couldn't pension be the same? So again, we set aside 2-3 years of extended disbursements and we invest that more aggressively. And then when we reach the 75-80%, or when we need to make disbursements, then those go more conservative.
Sure. Okay. So the difference between OPEB and pension is right now in pension, you already have 2 bank accounts, and the 115 and CalPERS. In OPEB right now, you only have 1 bank account. And so what this contemplates as the OPEB strategy, it contemplates adding a second bank account once you get certain percent funded. And so if you wanted to match these, OPEB's got 1 account, we're moving to 2. Pension already has 2 accounts. So the way you would actually, let me think about this. You could match in 2 ways. Either one, you turn pension into 3 bank accounts, which sounds a little bit administratively unnecessary, or you use your 115 like you're using your OPEB more conservative account that we just noted here, right? Once you hit a certain point, you set aside a year or 2 of estimated disbursements. That's your 115 account, and everything else goes to CalPERS.
So
because CalPERS is your more aggressive investment strategy.
Maybe that's the thing I'm hung up on. I'm not really thinking of CalPERS that way, but it is.
Yeah, and that's the difference, right? 2 bank accounts versus 1 at this present moment. We're going to move OPEB into a 2 bank account strategy with one risky, one less risky. On the pension side, your CalPERS account is your risky account. And
Yeah,
so
it just feels bad that we're saving this money and basically losing ground by holding on to it, right?
yes, exactly. And so the additional piece of this, I think, is a couple things, right? What we're talking about is the normal cost. That normal cost is going into this 115 trust on an annual basis. What I also think just for us to remember is part of this policy says any excess BSR at the end of any year, 50-50 goes to the 115 and the infrastructure reserve. So, there are these one-time influxes of cash that I think, putting a range on what you would want in the 115 trust with an investment earnings is appropriate. And then based on where things are at, staff will bring forward ADPs between bank accounts from your 115 to your CalPERS. Based on, are we in an up year or a down year from an economic standpoint? We will work with the actuary to determine what basis year is the most advantageous for us to pay down with that ADP in any given year. And so all of that kind of analysis can be brought forward at that point in time. I think the policy, it's important that it gives the guidance of when do we do those things, which sounds like, a year or two. You could make it like a BSR policy, target of blank percentage between blank and blank.
Yeah, but again, I feel like the recommendation here on the screen is still going the other direction, which would be even more conservative.
Well, then I would say we wouldn't do that. What you could do in the recommendation on the screen in the pension trust is you would say that you want to change the pension.
Even just the moderate instead of moderate conservative. That's kind of the opposite of what you're recommending here.
Right. We could do well because what staff was doing is actually mirroring OPEB, right? Yeah. If the 115 is the equivalent of your new second OPEB trust fund that we're creating when you get to a certain funded status, and assuming CalPERS is your risky investor.
I understand, but I'm saying even I think going even more conservative than we already are.
I'm trying to figure out what you want to do, Tom. Do you want to just blow away the thing that says more conservative strategy when we reach 75? Just blow that away completely?
That's what I was kind of getting to, but then even then I was thinking back, I'm looking at my notes from our previous discussion. And even then we were in this moderately conservative portfolio. Even then it sounded like the moderate one would be a reasonable choice.
Right. I mean, 75% to 75 to 80% funded. Okay. I mean, still means we're in the hole hundreds of millions of dollars. Right?
Yes.
Okay. So it's not like our kids going to college next year and we have to get our 529 into T-bills or something like that.
Right.
Yep.
So again, is it just no change, just delete that recommendation, or is it actually to go the other way and say move from moderately conservative to moderate?
Either.
I'm okay with that.
Okay, so I guess I would make that motion.
You better ask Lydia though. I mean, there's three of us here.
Yeah.
She's ready.
I nod my head. Yeah. I mean, based on what you said, right? So it didn't sound like we're going the conservative route. So yeah, no problem.
Okay.
It really is. I mean, it really is an evergreen long-term thing, right?
Yeah.
Because in reality, what's going to happen is, I mean, we model this, the simplification we model is that we say, okay, well, what's our debts due? And, there's this date that it's all due. And we say, okay, the value of the UAL at, 2040 is going to be X or something like that. It's still, it's actually a whole bunch of payments over time, as we see from the table. And, in reality, okay, if the liability is 80% funded, okay, it's not going to be starting in 2040, okay, every retiree gets 80% of their pension. Okay, that's not going to happen. Okay, they're going to get 100% of their pension, but the people who are retiring in 2060 are going to be at 100% risk, as opposed to the people in 2040 being at 20% risk, right? And so, again, it's a much longer time period. So, until we get this thing paid down, okay, there aren't going to be any short-term, we're almost there kind of stuff to worry about. So keeping it in a more aggressive portfolio from a long-term perspective makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. So again, I'll wait till the end to make the motion, but we'll put a pin in that one that we would change that. And then let's scroll down to the next page. So this gets to when do we make EDPs? So do we leave it at the excess of 1 year, or do we change it? I guess that's the question, right? And why is staff suggesting we change it? You just wanted to give us some options. Okay.
How much money is 1 year?
Right now, about 50 million. Yeah. We're probably 1 or
So
2 years away.
5% of the total.
And as an evergreen policy, right, we're never going to hit it smack on the dot. So if perhaps the committee wishes to put a range in there, no more than 2 years, no less than 1 year, that's also fine as well. It's really the policy question of, do we want that fund to, start growing exponentially, or do we want to make that kind of regular feed of additional discretionary payments? So again, not that we're underfunding pensions or using the 115 to pay our normal pensions.
Well, yeah, but again, we're still talking about moving money we've already saved
That's
between
correct.
accounts as opposed to saving more money.
Correct.
Right. So
Absolutely correct.
So the gravity is different.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
I guess, so maybe one lens council should think about is, again, politically for like future councils, what's easier to understand, right?
Never
look at all these
underfund the
charts.
normal cost.
No, but you look at all these charts, and what you really want to see is, okay, we have a $500 million liability, and we have these 2 bank accounts. And
Right.
so, a council might feel good. Oh, we've got $100 million in our Section 115 trust, but we still owe $400 million.
I'm working on that.
So is it better to not let that trust account grow just politically? Like, does it make people feel better than they should?
I think even councils can understand, right? The notion of one savings trust spread over 2 accounts. Even councils can understand that. And if councils can understand it, anybody can understand it.
I would say being able to identify between those bank accounts as one is kind of your stabilizing fund. This is your active checking account, right? You've got money going into it on an annual basis, and you can choose to put it in a savings or your money market or your retirement fund, whatever it may be. If you think about it from, you have the checking account and a savings account. I think if you keep your 115 as that kind of tool, that vehicle for the consistent kind of hum of activity, and you use your CalPERS as really where the home of your assets are, is probably an easy way for a council to think about this in the future. That way you don't have dueling bank accounts with dueling purposes, but you have 2 bank accounts with clear purposes. One is to, deal with this long-term liability that we've got, and the other one is to help us manage it. And so you've got a pathway to and from, which would lead likely to you keep a year or 2 in there, and that's it.
So you want to go time versus amount?
Because the amount will change. Our annual pension contribution amount will change. So the amount will change with it in terms of the trust fund. Our pension contributions a few years ago were $30 or $40 million.
I see.
We're now at 50. So,
And to some extent, that'll correlate with sort of the size of the overall trust, because as we pay the UAL down, then the overall trust will shrink. And then so a year's worth of contributions will
correct.
also shrink, because
exactly
the
right.
the ULC is based on the size of the UAL. And if that shrinks, the ULC will shrink and so forth.
Yes, that's exactly right.
So Eric, Lydia, do you guys have a proposal? Keep it at the 1 year? Do we go 2 years, or do we go the other direction?
I don't feel terribly strong. I'm happy with 1 year, but I'm also happy with 2 years. I'm happy with 5%. So if you got a preference.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just keep it the way it is at the 1 year.
Yeah,
Sold.
yeah, same one.
And then aligning with the ALM study, I think, does anybody disagree with that?
But you still come to doing budgets, you would have a, okay,
Of course, it's this full-fledged where we've had now multiple conversations on it, where we look at the actuarial reports, we converse with PARs and CalPERS on kind of where are the funds at, how are the investments going, and we do this kind of full policy review. We will, of course, bring forward all of the actions as part of the budget, but it's this kind of more in-depth, do we have the right principles governing us?
it's just that it's very hard for the other council members who are not in the finance committee looking at all of this to kind of get it. So as long as there's touches on it and reminders, I think that will work out.
Absolutely. We will always bring the annual CalPERS valuation reports to this committee. It's just, do we have Bartel do another 100 pages of analysis every single year? Or do we have them do that when we check on our status towards our goals?
Well, that's a bit of a policy decision too, because the annual CalPERS valuation reports have some inaccuracies in it. The question is, do we want to just live with that and put a big asterisk on and say, yeah, guys, there's some significant inaccuracies in these, or do we want to go sort of see, okay, here's what we think is more accurate, and that's what F&F have to do for us.
It is. I will say there is an in-between, which is what we've been doing over the last 3 years, which is we'll run alternative assumptions through either GovInvest platform or the CalPERS platform. And so when we bring those actuarial reports, CalPERS reports forward in the what I'll call off years for this kind of year, we do try to run those through to say at a high level where are we at, but we don't have a full-fledged study based on all of our factors.
We do that every 3 years now or 4 or something.
The full-fledged study? Yeah. Well, we're recommending we do it every 4 years and sync it with the ALM study.
So if we're okay with that, I think we're basically saying, what are we saying? Kind of keep the existing policies except for changing the Section 115 investment strategy and switch to the 4 years, and right, pretty much everything.
Yeah, so I would say that if the motion the committee wants to make is that the committee recommends that council approve the recommended changes to the pension funding policy with the following revisions, adjusting our 115 investments to a balanced investment level. And I think that's it.
Yep.
And well, again, the pension trust payment, no changes, right? So you did have some proposals here, but we're saying keep it as is.
Yep. Unless the council or the committee makes a recommendation to change it in their motion, we would assume keep it as is.
Right. So again, I mean, we're pretty much adopting the gray, except for we're not doing it for the ADPs.
Correct.
That's correct. Okay.
That's correct. Yep.
Right. So I'll make that motion.
Second.
Okay. All those in favor, Lydia?
Yes.
Yes.
Eric? And I vote yes. Okay. So that was very good discussion for not many changes.
Terribly important, though, to make sure everyone's understanding the policy decisions and appreciate the thought.
Before we leave it completely, I mean, as F&F's got tired of hearing tonight, you know, they've fallen into a nest of normal cost hot here, but in terms of the amortization of the UAL, I think at some point we ought to have a look at what this looks like using the ALM figures as opposed to the CalPERS figures. I mean, we ought to know how big is the breadbox here.
So what we can do if the committee wishes to make that as a second motion is refer that, have council turn that into a referral for staff to run those numbers for to be reported out as part of the CalPERS reporting. It would just be a one-off referral.
So moved.
Second.
I'm sorry, say the motion again.
Kylie said it, I didn't.
Okay, so I think
Referring to staff.
yeah, so the committee is recommending the council refer to staff a recalculation
Of the UAL amortization schedule using ALM expected returns.
correct.
Once every 4 years.
No, I believe Councilmember Philseth is just asking us to do this as a one-off
Right.
to be included with future reporting out on pension status.
Right.
I'm still confused when you say a one-off.
Meaning that it's not part of this policy. It's a referral to staff of an action item for us to do, but because it requires more than an hours of staff time, and frankly, it will require consulting services costs.
Yep.
Refer that to the council for them to give the
Right.
direction.
But you're going to do it once, but then 4 years from now, we will not do it.
Oh, well, I think, 4 years from now, one of the scenarios, because they give us 3 scenarios, right? They give us a nominal scenario, they give us a 25, a 50, and a 75 scenario. So I think one of
isn't
the
your
scenarios
interest-
should be the ALM scenario.
Yeah, isn't your interest in doing this as a regular part of the process?
Yes, every
Not
4
just
years
a-
is fine.
Not just a one-off.
Correct. It's just that, as Assistant City Manager Nose points out, I don't want to wait 4 years before we see the first one.
Okay. So all those in favor, Lydia,
Yes.
Eric,
Yes.
and I'll vote yes. Okay, thank you. Should we move on to item number 3, which is the first quarter financial report?
We should, and in the interest of time, since we still have the long-range financial forecast after this, I'm wondering if, at the pleasure of the committee and the chair, if you would like staff to skip the presentation.
Could you just run through it quickly, maybe?
We will do the expeditious version. All right.
Timer starts.
Christine Paras here again, introducing Rosalind Fernando. You met her last week on AFR, so here to present the Q1 financial results.
Thank you, Christine. Good evening, Finance Committee. So tonight we are here to present the fiscal year 2023 first quarter financial report. This is focusing on the general fund and enterprise fund only. And this is for informational purposes only, and the balances are preliminary or unaudited balances. Next slide, please. The first slide is about the general fund revenue. The first 2 columns are the actuals for the first 2 quarters, while the third is the percentage change, and these actuals are compared with adjusted budget. The first quarter general fund revenue in total are 1.5% higher than the prior year and are tracking at 14.4% of the adjusted budget. Property tax is very nominal for the first quarter. We usually receive that in November and March. Sales tax have increased by 0.6 million or 29.1%. The actuals of 2.6 million or 2.5 represents 1 month sales activity due to the delay between the state sales collections and remittance to the city. Another major tax will be the TOT. This is up by 1.2 million or 81.3% from prior year, and it's 14.6% of the adjusted budget. This represents about 1.5 months of collections. While the outlook of the local activity appears positive for both TOT and sales tax, adjusted budget still below pre-pandemic levels. Another major tax would be the documentary transfer tax. This have decreased 0.9 million or 41.5% from prior year and 16.7% of the adjusted budget. Oh, I'm sorry. Where am I? Documentary transfer tax. Staff continues to monitor this receipts closely due to significant fluctuations that can occur anytime, depending on the real estate sales activity. On the top of the major taxes, one of the big variants is the charge for services revenue, which is up by 1.1 million or 20.6% adjusted budget. This is mostly coming from the CSD due to the program and class revenue, which because the increase of enrollees and additional programs. Next slide, please. General fund expenditure, the same thing. The first two columns are the actuals for the first quarter, 2023 and 22. And then third column is the percentage change. And these are compared to the adjusted budget. The general fund expenditures, excluding encumbrances, are 13.7% higher from prior year and are tracking at 20.4% of the adjusted budget, which is comparable with the 2022. The increase is due to the increased salary and benefit expense, including overtime, and due to the 4%, mainly due to the 4% cost of living adjustment wage increase for all labor groups, effective April 2022. However, if we include the encumbrance found on the attachment A, packet page number 15, expenses are tracking at 29% adjusted budget. The first two lines, police and fire expenses, comprise 48.1% of the total general fund expenditures for the first quarter, which is also 16.2% compared to the prior year. This is due to the higher salary rate and also due to the higher police overtime than prior year due to the vacancies, extended leave, and catching up with hiring and training. While the fire overtime is 11% decrease, the department expected the overtime to rise as there is more staff turnover. Analysis is on packet page 11 and attachment 8, page 16. Next slide, please. Budget stabilization reserve, as discussed last week, we ended up 72.8 million. However, after uses, it will bring down to 59.8 million with a surplus of 14.2 million compared to the council target. And staff anticipates returning to council in Feb 2023 with a fiscal year 2023 mid-year review and recommendations for the appropriations of the above 18.5% level. Next slide, please. This is the enterprise net position. The total change in net position is 7.6 million. There is an increase of 5.9 million compared from last year. And the increase are mainly due to there's that impact of 5.9 million. So there are various reasons for that. First would be the water fund. Water fund decreased 1.6 million or 30% from prior year due to the overall decrease in revenue and increase in operation costs. Revenue decreased despite a 4% rate increase due to conservation effort, and also increase in operation costs is due to the commodity purchases and salaries and wages. Another big variance would be the gas fund. It increased about 0.9 million or 158% from prior year due to a 2.1 million increase in revenue from customer sales, partially offset by higher commodity purchases. There is a 4% rate increase effective July 1, 2022. Another main variance would be the wastewater treatment, increased 6.4 million. This is only a result of an earlier receipt of 4.8 million in partner payments. This is only a timing difference. And there is also a receipt of 1.7 million from California State Water Resource Control Board for the primary sedimentation tank project. That concludes the first quarter result for fiscal year 2023. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions or comments from council members?
I was curious about when we've done well again on ERAF, on ERA. How do you pronounce ERAF? ERAF, right? Right. In previous years, we've sort of been conservative and said, well, we're expecting, we might get a big drop in ARF, and it hasn't happened, right? Are we still anticipating we're at risk there? Is that, or is it, we think that's no longer, likely?
I think previously there was a lawsuit with the state on that, and a new lawsuit arose, so then closed out reserves for that. So it's still at risk. And the latest we heard from the county was about 30% of this year's distribution is at risk.
Okay. So there's still a lawsuit pending. So
Yes.
that's why.
Yes,
okay.
another one, a new one.
A new one. Whiskey's for fighting over.
I've been reading a lot of economic reports about, changes to downtowns and calling it an office apocalypse. Are we still seeing sales tax lagging on Cal Ave? I think our last report, we saw university had kind of recovered, but Cal Ave was still lagging.
Yeah, and I believe that is actually the most current information we still have at this point. We do have sales tax information, obviously, because we get cash on a monthly basis, but we don't get those full economic reports, except on a quarterly basis. So
Okay.
that last analysis, I think, is still the most current.
Yeah. Again, I know I'm in a minority on the council, but I'm still concerned that, closing those streets, the restaurant hours are pretty limited versus other businesses that were kind of opened all day. And I worry that we're still seeing the impact there.
I will note that for ourselves and for Steve Guagliardo with economic development work, since I know we do have touch points coming up as we move through the data side on the economic development strategy.
Okay, cool. The other one that jumped out at me was just police overtime up about 100%. And again, is that a concern for the rest of the year? Are they trying to rein that in?
I would say that the police department is abundantly aware of where their overtime is tracking, and I don't expect it to abate as we move through this year. In fact, I would expect a mid-year adjustment for that. With their hiring, as they continue to try and hire vacant positions, they are doing, or rather have staff on overtime to support the FTO trainings, as well as they are doing more overtime to deal with some of the more kind of special operations that are going on right now as we deal with kind of the holiday season, visibility in the downtown and the mall areas, as well as that special unhoused services support. So I do think that this is in relation to service needs or service demands that the department is facing, and they're doing what they can to offset those additional costs so that it will be a net neutral to the general fund. But I do expect that likely in mid-year, we will see a request for some additional funding.
Yeah, I mean, if it's service driven, that's one thing. It's just a concern that the longer it goes on, people get used to, that much of overtime, and then it's not sustainable, right?
Absolutely.
Lydia, any comments?
No, you mentioned one of mine, but which is the California Avenue one. No, thank you.
Okay, and this is just an information report, right? So we'll move on to our last item, the long range financial forecast.
All right, and so we have Paul Harper and Jesse Deschamps joining us again with the Office of Management and Budget, who will tag team this presentation. And as we go through this, obviously many assumptions ties back to both your 2023 Q1, which we went through, and the status of those estimates are all fed into here. And the pension policy and the assumptions that are in there are all also obviously feeding into this document as well. So as the clerk pulls up the presentation, I believe Paul Harper will kick us off. Jesse Deschamps, I lied, will kick us off. Thank you, Jesse.
All right, next slide. So overall, this long-range financial forecast assumes a stagnant economy for major tax revenues where some tax categories remain below pre-pandemic levels. Both Measure L, which is the natural gas transfer, and Measure K, which is the new business tax, are expected to be successfully gaining a voter approval, where Measure L is assumed in the base case and Measure K is not assumed in the base case. However, we do include an alternative scenario that assume Measure K. This forecast is based on current approved service levels and assumes that the 2-year budget restorations approved in the fiscal year 2023 adopted budget are funded on an ongoing basis. At projected funding levels, staff anticipates that labor negotiations and priority reinvestments will be key factors in budget development. Although the city's experienced a one-time surplus in fiscal year 2022 and estimates a surplus in 2023, this forecast shows that net revenue streams from ballot measures are key in ensuring fiscal stability. Next slide, please. The local economy continues to show strong performance in the latter half of calendar year 2022, though signs of headwinds are growing that could stem economic growth. In response to rising inflation, the Federal Reserve began raising interest rates in March 2022 and is expected to continue raising rates with the aim of cooling the economy and in turn slowing inflation. The California Legislative Analyst Office, or LOA, recently released their fiscal outlook, issued in advance of the state budget process. Similar to projections and forecasts, their outlook assumes a midpoint between a more pessimistic view, where inflation pressures remain and raise the risk of recession, and an optimistic view, where raising interest rates tame inflation pressures to create a safe landing. Next slide, please. All right, shown in the dark gray line, the base case forecast projects a net one-time surplus of $364,000 in fiscal year 2024, followed by a $3.4 million gap in 2025, a $2.6 million gap in 2026, and small but increasing surpluses throughout the remainder of the forecast. Fluctuations in the near term stabilize in fiscal year 2027 and are impacted by several activities, including a mild 18-month stagnation at the start of the forecast, new revenue streams for Measure L, which offset costs of services to be funded by these revenues, and the elimination of one-time resources that have previously boosted the fiscal outlook. Next slide. This graph represents the major tax revenues by category. To the left of the red line are historical actuals, and to the right of the red line are fiscal year 2023 adopted numbers and forecasted levels. So as shown in this graph, property tax makes up the largest source of general fund revenues at about 25%. This revenue category experiences a 1 to 2 year delay in an economic downturn, ultimately seeing a flattening of growth from the pandemic in 2022-2023. This revenue source is expected to experience steady increases throughout the forecast. Sales tax recovery began in the last quarter of fiscal year 21 and has continued through Q1 of fiscal year 2023. However, this rate of recovery is expected to lessen in the forecast. Recovery to pre-pandemic levels is not expected until fiscal year 2026. Transient occupancy tax, or TOT, experienced significant declines during the pandemic as a result of public health orders and diminished demand for travel. This category began to recover and grow in fiscal year 2022 as those restrictions were lifted. Additionally, the opening of 2 Marriott hotels in mid and late fiscal year 2021 helped to drive recovery. This revenue category is experiencing growth, however, is not expected to reach pre-pandemic levels until fiscal year 2026. Utility users tax, or UUT, is dependent on user consumption levels and is expected to recover as the local economy recovers and workers return to the office. Revenue in this category is expected to reach pre-pandemic levels in 2025. And then lastly, documentary transfer tax, or DTT, is projected to decrease as compared to prior years. This is because the category is highly volatile and dependent on sales volume and the mix of commercial and residential sales. In prior years, there have been record receipts that are primarily due to several large commercial transactions. This level of receipt is not anticipated to continue in the forecast. Next slide. Turn over to Paul.
Thank you, Jesse. Paul Harper, Budget Manager with the Office of Management and Budget. Some things to keep in mind, in every long range forecast, there are assumptions not included, or as we heard in public comment, risks not included. These are more commonly known as known unknowns. And are areas of investment that are priorities but have not been fully developed in terms of costs or timelines. These items will be more defined and brought forward as part of future budget processes. To keep in mind, this list is not comprehensive. It's not in priority order, but a few things to highlight. The city reinvested in services that were impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the overall capacity to provide services is still below the pre-pandemic levels and have not been restored as part of this long-range forecast. Labor negotiations are currently in process, as all labor agreements are scheduled to expire on December 31st of this year, with the exception of the SEIU hourly unit, which expires in June of 2023. As directed by the council, the long range includes a reserve to reach target market placement for employee compensation in the new labor agreements. And in keeping with prior council direction, a 2% annual wage adjustment is included as a forecasting assumption. This is not meant to be a commitment to future negotiations, and staff expects these to adjust as salary costs are more determined and negotiations continue. A number of large capital projects have been identified as needs. However, the final costs and timelines have not been determined at this time to include them in the 5-year capital improvement plan. A few of these projects include projects identified in the Parks Master Plan, the railroad grade separation projects, the animal shelter facility, and new fire training facility. Cubberley Community Center has a number of capital needs as well. This is funded separately in the Cubberley Community Infrastructure Fund and have been identified in the concept plan, as well as the current repair needs at the gym. These have not been included again in the long range. And lastly, there are a number of council priority items that have been funded with some limited resources. However, in order to continue these programs, additional ongoing resources would likely be necessary. A few of these include the Sustainability and Climate Action Plan, or the SCAP, the Project Home Key project, racial equity work, and a permanent parklet program. Next slide, please. So in addition to the base case, Jesse went over, the long-range financial forecast includes 2 alternate scenarios. As noted in the report, the impacts from these scenarios are likely to occur simultaneously, but we modeled them separately to show the impacts for each of them compared to the base case individually. This first scenario shows the impacts of a moderate recession compared to the base cases, more economic stagnation, basically slower growth in major tax revenues, increase the depth of the budget gap to 7.2 million in 2025, and it extends the gap through fiscal year 2028 instead of the 2 years in the base case. Next slide, please. The second alternate scenario assumes the inclusion of the funding from the passage of Measure K, or the new business tax measure. Approximately 30% of the revenue from Measure K is assumed to offset eligible expenses, and the funding is programmed to start in 2024 with a ramp up to the full collection by 2026 based on the parameters established in the ballot measure for tax collection. In this scenario, the budget gap is reduced to a 1-year gap of about 1.9 million in fiscal year 2025. Next slide. As part of the report, attachment A is the fiscal year 2024 budget development guidelines. We bring forward these guidelines every year to help in developing the budget. A few to highlight here are recommending allocating ongoing resources with ongoing needs, as well as one-time resources for one-time needs in order to keep it fiscally sustainable, appropriating resources for identified council priorities, exploring alternatives and service delivery models to maximize resources, incorporating new revenue sources as directed by council, and proactively funding long-term liabilities. Next slide. So in conclusion, revenue trends indicate economic recovery. However, there are signs of a possible recession or stagnant economy. The city is positioned to manage through the current long-range economic outlook, and the base case and the alternate scenario should be used as planning tools to assist staff and finance committee and council in doing this. Staff anticipates that the fiscal year 23 mid-year report will include recommendations for additions related to areas of priority or urgent needs. And the next steps in the overall annual budget process are reviewing the long-range financial forecast by council, which will happen in January, followed by council's review of the mid-year report in February, and then the release of the proposed budget in May. Next slide. Lastly, this is the recommended action for tonight. It's a finance committee review and recommend that city council accept the 2024 through 2023 long range base case and 2024 budget development guidelines, and direct staff to use the forecast as a starting point for the fiscal year 2024 budget process. And that concludes the presentation, and we're here for questions.
Great. And you haven't gone to the public for the previous two items. I'm just checking. I don't see anybody online. There's nobody there, right? Great. Okay. So yeah, council members, you have questions, comments?
I thought it looked straightforward, right? I guess means the council is going to take it up in January. So Lydia, it's your problem.
Boy,
I think there's more than me.
Right.
Short
I
timer
guess-
syndrome. Hitting
I
hard.
guess one thing that, as we were going through the development of sort of the last couple of years and the case for measures K and L and so forth. One thing that we looked at during that process and kind of hadn't before, and I'm not sure what the right place for this is, right? Maybe it's part of the long range financial analysis, maybe it's not, right? But if you look at public safety in particular, public safety, I saw is between police and fire is 48% of general fund expenses at the moment. And that's up from where it's been, but for the last 15, 20 years, it's sort of been consistently 35, 40% of the general fund, right? And so you would look at that and say, that seems financially well managed, right? And yet at the same time, over the last 15 years, in order to maintain that proportion, staffing in both fire and police has declined 30% since 2004, at least until the last couple of years. And and the reason for that is that costs have escalated faster than revenues, right? And so forth. I can't say whether that's the right thing to do or not, and the right way to manage our business, but I don't think anybody knew, right? Okay, until the last few years. It's not something we were paying attention to. And I wonder if there's somehow that ought to be part of the long range financial planning, to look at some of these things and say, okay, here's our long range financial trends, here's and so forth, and here's by certain key functions, here's what staffing is. Here's what's happening with staffing and why. And I wonder if that should be part of the financial forecast, or maybe not. Maybe it should be someplace else, right? But this seems like the kind of forum that we talk about these things, if that makes any sense. So I don't have a particular direction or motive or suggestion on it, but I think future councils and staffs, this is something we ought to look at and manage.
Lydia?
I don't have anything to say. Thank you.
And you guys are easy.
Well, it's depressing, so it's better not to say anything.
Chair?
I'm sorry, I think I froze there a second. I don't know if you heard me, Lydia. Did you have any questions or comments?
No comments, no questions.
Okay.
Well, go ahead. I'll make one more, which is, we've done this in the last 8 years that I've been sort of associated on council, and I assume it's not going to change, but all these long range financial forecasts are sort of a little bumpy in the near years, and then they all have this hockey stick in the out years.
Yeah,
Right.
that's gonna come.
And you know, one of the reasons for that is, you know, we make, you know, very, very conservative assumptions about expense growth in the out years, right? And I understand why we do that, okay? But the net result of that is, we get this big hockey stick out in the out years. So as long as everybody understands that.
Yeah,
And this
somehow
is
the
another one of
expenses rise up to that line. So one question, you said the report says we're not going to restore all services, but that seems to be quantified by head count. And I'm wondering, have we kind of getting to Eric's point about head count and safety, but you know, can we actually quantify what services we lost, or have we in fact like automated some of them and, you know, and replaced them in ways that don't use people as much?
I think that's a good point. You know, the way that we have quantified it is by head count, but when we've been talking about bringing back services that were cut, we've been really trying to work with departments to say, you know, maybe we don't need to bring it back the way it was done before, and maybe we can do something differently. So I'm trying to think of a different way that we could do that other than, you know, polling the departments to say, how do you feel your services compared to before the, you know, the pandemic? But yeah, I think that's a good point. And so that is what we focused on in the report. But to your point, Councilmember, they, you know, some services have been brought back in a different manner, and that's sort of the idea behind reinvestment and not just restoration of what was taken away before.
Yeah, I mean, if there are things that have really changed, it would just be good to see a description, like libraries are not open as many days or whatever it is, rather than just head count.
Got to factor contractors in there in some cases too, though. For example, so we outsourced aquatics. Okay, so headcount, that part of community services headcount declined, although service to the community didn't decline. It just got on a different part of the ledger.
Right. I'd rather see a list of programs and services no longer offered. I guess if you could go to slide 6. I think back at the beginning of the meeting, you know, Nielsen Buchanan mentioned the potential change to office growth, and I mentioned it in the last item as well. I'm wondering if, you know, we have property tax revenue kind of up and to the right. We have TOT kind of coming back. I wonder if we could look at a scenario that says offices remain occupied at like a 50% rate ongoing. You know, you know, what happens if property tax does not grow that way? And you know, we don't have the commuters, and we don't see the hotel travel, business travel. It seems like that's a fairly possible scenario.
Well, most of property tax is residential, not commercial.
Right, but I think sometimes it gets juiced by some big office purchases.
ETT.
To council, to the council discussion going on, the immediate kind of spike from those large office transitions or transfers, thank you, are going to show up in DET. To your point, Chair Du Bois, to the extent those transfers are not happening, because usually with commercial, what will happen is the transfer happens and then they do tenant improvements that'll impact the AV, the assessed value of that property. So to the extent transactions are down, likely improvements are down, likely growth in AV may be down. It really just depends though, because the piece on office versus residential is when it last turned. So one of the aspects of our growth in property tax that account for over 1% of our annual growth, like 1 percentage point, not 1% of the growth. So if we grow 6%, over 1 of that 6% is attributed to the actual transfer of property, both residential and commercial, and it's the jump in value. So it's because that property was held for 2 decades and being assessed the general 2% CI for Prop 13. And then when it finally transfers, there's a big gap to close. And so that is a significant, not a significant, but it is a notable portion of our annual revenue increase in property tax, both on residential and commercial. So I think it would be difficult, I think, to try and segment out property tax for commercial office only.
Yeah. Well, it strikes me if work from home, persists, and again, we have a lot less commuters than before, maybe it really looks like an extended recession rather than a recession being a blip. It's kind of a new normal, and we don't really model that, and I guess we would adjust our long range forecast over time, but it's something to think about.
Absolutely. And it may, I mean, honestly, with the different trends, these are things that we just don't quite know yet. And we will continue to monitor. I would, with the assessor's office, they provide us updates on appeals of the assessed value. That usually, if people are bringing forward contesting what the assessed value is of their property, which would make changes, frankly, to the property tax roll. So obviously, when we're in this kind of tepid situation, that's going to be something we'll be watching on a quarterly basis to see if there are any emerging trends from that perspective, really looking at changes in the value of the space given changes in office habits.
Just a couple other comments about the report. I mean, I'm really concerned about the Coverly gym repair. I think that impacts a lot of kids, and I really think we need to make that a priority. I know it's really expensive. I don't know if we looked at parklets as a revenue source or at least revenue neutral. And then, there's just all this inflationary pressure on labor costs. And we just went to pension tonight. We got pension costs, we have medical costs inflating, and salaries. And I really think we've got to manage that carefully. It's our biggest cost as a city. So in scenario B, which includes both measures which passed, we have that $3 million gap. Is that basically going to be covered by the economic uncertainty reserve?
Yes, staff expect that what we'll do is proactively plan for that and set those funds aside to be dealt with that reserve.
Okay. And then the other question is, and again, we're talking about 10-year forecast, is maybe a scenario, and maybe it's too early right now, but to look at revenue from a new fiber utility, because I do think if we do move forward, those transfers could be a lot larger than what we see with gas utility. So it's just something to think about. And then the last one was really about the climate action plan. Are most of those expenses just hitting the utility primarily?
At present, yes. As we continue to build out programs, it will become something that will be a shared responsibility across multiple funds. We will need to be very careful with the fact that utility funds are highly regulated. And right now we've been using funding sources that are not necessarily ratepayer funds, but low carbon emission funds or other eligible costs that can go in the utility funds. So I do think as we continue to build out SCAP, that we will need to look at all funding sources. And that's part of the work plan that staff expect to be viewed by the council. I know we defer that item, but ultimately as part of that work plan, there's both resources as well as obviously a need to fund those resources.
Right. But I guess big chunk of it will be parts of people's jobs whose salaries we're already modeling. And I guess it's any additional projects, consulting or whatever that we would need to add in.
The 3-year work plan does outline a significant level of resources that are needed if we are to execute all aspects of the SAP plan. So we'll have to evaluate that when we evaluate that plan and then bring forward any new resources as part of either mid-year or the proposed in 2024.
Okay. Any other council member comments?
Well, I just wanted to add also that, for revenue sources, right, you mentioned parklets, but also goes back to economic development, right? So I think that that's a very big part of it on looking at, we have less office rentals, leases and so forth, less commuters, which for the most part, we were told that they were the main source of sales tax. So now with more work at home, we need to kind of focus a little bit, more economic development based on people here who are living here. So that's another focus I'd like to see added.
Okay, so I think we're just basically asked to accept this and forward it to council and use it as a basis for the budget process. So I'll make that motion.
Second.
Okay, and Eric, how do you vote?
Aye.
Lydia?
Yes.
And I vote yes.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Taryn and Christine for all your work on this.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, it's really a massive document. Thank you guys.
Oh, and all of OMB too. I shouldn't just thank Jesse and Paul, all of OMB. It's the whole team behind them.
Great. So that concludes this meeting. I guess this is our last meeting of the year. So I wanted to thank Lydia and Eric, as well as all the staff who've supported us for the year. And Lydia, good luck next year.
It's
you,
been
guys.
it's
Nice
been
to finish
wonderful
all the
serving
chair.
with the two of you. And thank you, Mahia.
Thanks, committee. It's been a pleasure this year.
All right, meeting adjourned. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.